go ahead and get started. So before we get started, I just wanted to ask you for some gets, and that's what I call them. So the first thing is I want you to get rid of distractions. I want to make sure that you are here and ready to listen. I want to make sure you're going to get ready to learn. We have a lot to cover over the next hour. I want you to get in the mindset that you paid for this webinar. So a lot of times, especially when webinars are free, we feel like, well, we'll watch the webinar, but I'll also do 5 other things while I'm watching the webinar. I want to make sure that you get everything you can out of the webinar. There's a lot of information in the webinar that could really make a difference for you. So just if you kind of get in that mindset that you did pay for the webinar, maybe that will help change the way you perceive the webinar a little bit. Consider this a coaching session. This is what I do. I'm a consultant, and I offer coaching sessions, and do yourself a favor and consider this a free coaching session, essentially. And if you stick around at the end of the webinar, I will tell you how to get a copy of the webinar, and then you can forward the webinar on to anybody you want, or you can watch it again. I also would love for you to get a notepad and a pen and take good old-fashioned notes as we go through, and get your keyboard ready. This is an interactive webinar, and I'm going to ask you some questions throughout the way. Plus, I want you to feel free to ask me questions as we go along. So, get ready to be fully participatory in this. So just before I get started, wanted to share a little bit about myself and how I got interested in workplace bullying. So I became interested in workplace bullying because I was a human resources manager for an organization here in San Diego where I live, and I worked with a bully. And while I was working there, I started going through graduate school and ended up doing a paper on the topic of workplace bullying in graduate school, and became really fascinated by what I was learning, and realized that this is something that a lot of organizations suffer from, and that my president's response, which was to say, don't worry about it, don't let it bother you, was a pretty standard response. And it was a very real problem that CEOs, the C-suite executive leaders, don't understand the full intensity of workplace bullying. They don't understand the full damage that workplace bullying can cause. So this is this idea that the CEO needs to be sold on workplace bullying was initially what got my interest in this topic of workplace bullying, and something that I've continued to really try to understand how to make sure that the CEO understands the full issue so that they agree to make change. I did write a book a few years ago called Back Off, Your Kick-Ass Guide to Ending Bullying at Work, and I've got a couple websites there for you. Definitely once the webinar is over if you haven't. We are going to cover 2 things over the course of this webinar. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes just defining bullying and talking about what it is, just so that we're all on the same page. If you've seen any of my other webinars or ever seen me speak, you've already seen that information, but it's always good to just kind of make sure we're all on the same page. And then the rest of the webinar, I will give you 3 steps to follow, and if you follow those 3 steps, you will be able to sell your CEO on the idea that change is needed, and that workplace bullying is a real problem that needs to be solved. Before I jump in, I want to ask you, what roadblocks do you face in ending bullying? So obviously you're here because perhaps your CEO or the C-suite is one roadblock. You're not getting their support. What other roadblocks do you face in ending bullying? What is making it difficult for you to get in there and really get bullying to stop? And I'm going to take a drink of water while you think about it and type in your answers in the question box. All right, so I'm seeing time. It definitely takes a lot of time. I'm seeing money, that perhaps it's not in your budget, okay? I'm seeing just resources in general, and buy-in, absolutely. So those are kind of the 4 big ones, right, that you came up with. Okay, the CEO is the problem. The CEO is the bully. Okay, that's interesting. We can certainly address that, Lynn, as we go through the webinar. I will speak to that towards the end of the webinar. How about that? All right. So hang on to those answers. We're going to touch base on those answers a little bit later. So I'm just going to go ahead and move forward and talk about what bullying is. So there are three components central to the definition of workplace bullying. The first is that workplace bullying is repeated. So one of the questions I get, or one of the reasons CEOs find it difficult to understand bullying, is sometimes they feel like you're saying, well, John's in a bad mood sometimes, and you know, people don't like it, and that's what they hear when you're describing the workplace bullying. But bullying is a very pervasive, insidious kind of a behavior, and researchers like to quantify things, and the researchers have kind of put this number on bullying, that bullying happens about once a week for a period of 6 months, and that's, you know, when they would consider it bullying. That doesn't mean that if somebody comes to you and complains about bullying, that, you know, if it hasn't been 6 months, you turn them away and tell them to come back in 6 months. But, you know, just to give you an idea of what we mean by repeated. So at least once a week for a period of 6 months. And actually, research has found that bullies often bully for a period of 2 years before the target starts to figure out ways to leave the organization. So the 2-year mark is when the target starts to realize they've sort of had enough. The next component of the definition of bullying is that it creates a psychological power imbalance. So what happens is there's an initial bullying incident where the bully pushes on the target in some way, whether it's just an eye roll during a staff meeting, or you know, they send a nasty email, or there's some bullying act. And for whatever reason, the target doesn't speak up for themselves in that situation. And the bully develops this idea, and it's probably more subconscious than conscious, but they recognize that, hey, I sent a nasty email to that person and they didn't speak up. Maybe I can push on them a little bit, and I can develop power over them. Now, all humans like power, you know, and it's part of the way we function. So there's this kind of switch that goes on in the bully's mind. It's like, well, I can pick on that person. So the bully begins to push on the target a little bit more, and the bully pushes a little bit more often and a little bit more aggressively, and over time this relationship develops like a crescendo, where the bully comes to realize more consciously that the bully has power over the target, and the target comes to realize consciously that the bully has power over him or her. So this relationship, again, it unfolds a little like a crescendo, and it sort of sneaks up on the target when you know, they come to this point of like, oh my gosh, this person has power over me, and I don't know what to do, and they start to feel helpless. The power imbalance is psychological, and that's the key point. So certainly you have hierarchy in an organization, so you have power imbalance in some way in an organization. But when the power imbalance is psychological, that's when it becomes unhealthy. And you can equate workplace bullying to something like domestic violence more than you can equate bullying to something like conflict, because this defining piece of workplace bullying is that there is a psychological power imbalance, much like what exists in a domestic violence relationship. The third component to the definition of bullying is that it causes harm to targets and witnesses. So obviously, when somebody feels that somebody else has an unfair psychological power over them, that's going to cause the person to feel anxious. They're going to be scared and fearful at work. They're going to be under a lot of stress, and it's no secret that stress causes a lot of physical harm to us. So if you psychologically are feeling stressed out, you know, you can't sleep, you can't eat, you can develop ulcers, you can develop heart disease. So, you know, there's a ton of research beyond workplace bullying that supports this idea that stress causes us a lot of physical damage, and that's what happens in the case of workplace bullying. So targets are becoming depressed. They're not functioning at work. Certainly, they're not functioning at top level, and it really affects them psychologically, and therefore it affects them physically. And it's important to note that people who don't necessarily self-identify as a bully So witnesses, even though they don't necessarily identify as someone who's being bullied, they do absolutely experience these same sorts of feelings. So I might go to work and I might watch John pick on Sue pretty constantly, and I don't feel like John picks on me, but it's going to bother me that I have to witness this every day. I'm certainly going to be walking on eggshells wondering when is John going to turn on me. I'm going to start to lose loyalty for managers if I can see that they're not stepping in to help Sue. And so witnesses go through this process of kind of watching the bullying unfold, and it's really bothersome for them as well. So bullying is damaging to targets, and it's certainly damaging for witnesses too. So I like to put bullying behaviors into 3 different buckets, and I've created these buckets based on the wide variety of surveys that are out there regarding workplace bullying. And as I was reviewing all of these surveys, I started to realize there was a pretty standard theme, and that there's really 3 behaviors that researchers have pinpointed in terms of bullying behaviors. So the first is aggressive communication. So this is communication that you can see. Nasty emails, getting in someone's space, getting in their personal space, making facial expressions that are, express disappointment or anger, yelling, that kind of thing. So communication you can actually really see. One example of this for me, I was an expert witness on a case against Walmart, actually, and in that scenario, it was 2 truck drivers, and one truck driver was basically bullying the other truck driver. They were partners as they traveled across the United States delivering Walmart goods stores. And the bully that was his MO. He was just an aggressive communicator. He yelled a lot. He said a lot of pretty nasty things to the other guy. And there were a couple times where the bully got in the target's face and stuck his finger in the target's nose. So he would fish hook the target. Target had the bully and couldn't get away from the bully. I think probably pushes things into violence, workplace violence, but that would certainly be an example of aggressive communication. The next bucket of behavior is acting. So leave the target being humiliated. Pointing out mistakes in public would be an example, or constantly talking to man mistakes so that this target is perceived by managers as a really poor performer. Spreading rumors, spreading gossip, taunting them with social media, saying pretty rude things, doing things that are where the point is to make that target feel humiliated. The third bucket of behavior is manipulation, and this is what makes bullying so difficult for a lot of people to understand unless they're experiencing it. Workplace bullying is very insidious, and it's under the radar, and so this is why bullying is getting so much attention and why it's so hard to get people on board with making a change. So I'll share a couple stories regarding manipulation. So one example is I gave a community workshop here in San Diego, and a woman attended the workshop, and she came up to me after the workshop was over, and she was just in tears. And she said, Catherine, I really need to talk with you. Everything you said is really resonating with me. Can we speak, at some point in the future? Can we meet for coffee? And so I said, sure. And so we met for coffee, and she shows up to coffee with this stack of papers. And one stack she has is her performance evaluations for the last 20 years. And she, had been a good employee. She'd been at this community college for 20 years, and she'd done relatively well. She'd had 5 managers over the course of those 20 years, and they'd all said she'd done pretty good. Well, then this other stack she brought was from the last couple years. She had a new manager, and this manager was bullying her. She felt that this manager was yelling at her. She was sending nasty emails. She was definitely sending emails about mistakes and things to higher up. but she was getting performance evaluations that said she was a really poor performer. Now, what made those bullying? Well, the performance evaluations basically just said, you stink, and that's it. And that's what made them bullying, in addition to, all of these other behaviors that were happening. So obviously, performance evaluations are not bullying. If an employee is not performing, you give them a performance evaluation and you address those. But in this context, the reason they were bullying is that they didn't offer any resources for the employee. They didn't say, here are the things you're doing well. They didn't say, here are some things that we can do to help you improve. Here's what I'm going to do to help you improve. Here's some training we're going to get you, or here's some goals. It just said you're not a good performer, and it listed all of these problems with her performance, and that was it. And so that felt like bullying, along with these other behaviors, and that was actually happening recently. A really good friend of mine is the director at a credit union here in San Diego, and she's being bullied. And she was telling me some of the behaviors that she's experiencing, and they're definitely manipulation. So she's being bullied by her VP of HR, who she reports to. And this VP of HR holds meetings constantly without inviting my friend, the Director of Learning and Development. So this VP of HR even holds meetings with my friend's staff members, my friends, people who directly report to her. And so she does this pretty often, and my friend keeps going to her boss, the bully, and saying, I need to be in on these meetings, or at least tell me when you're having them so I can decide to come. And the VP keeps saying, oh, I'm so sorry, I forgot, or I thought you were going to be out of the office. So she always has some reason why she didn't invite my friend. And so that feels manipulative because, and again, it's in addition to a lot of other behaviors, but that's an example where she feels that the bully is kind of purposely pushing her out, and she's feeling manipulated. One final comment on manipulation, or one other example. I wrote a letter for a woman to the EEOC. She was filing a complaint with the EEOC, and she wanted to talk about, or wanted to include bullying, even though, it's not necessarily against the law, but she wanted that to be part of what she talked about in her letter to the EEOC. And one of the ways that she was being bullied, one thing that counts as manipulation, is this woman worked in an office where they all had clients, and everyone else in the office had 30 clients. And this woman I wrote the letter for had 60 clients, so she had double the workload of everybody else in the office. And when she asked for, could we split up some of my work? I can't take 60, everybody else is 30. Can I give away some of my clients? The answer was no. She asked for overtime so she could handle her client load. The answer was no. She asked if she could have a part-time assistant to help her handle the workload. The answer was no. So the manager really left her in this position of an impossible workload. And then when her performance evaluation came around, she was, said that she wasn't a good performer. She wasn't able to keep up with the demands of the work. So another example of manipulation, the manager set this woman up for failure. She gave her double the workload, and then her performance evaluation said she couldn't perform. So one final comment on bullying before we move into talking about the point of the webinar, which is to sell change to the CEO. Just wanted to let you know there is definitely some major differences and some similarities between harassment and bullying. So the major difference is obviously that harassment is illegal because of Title VII, and workplace bullying is very legal. So what it is, and this is something I just still don't understand, but Title VII says that you cannot harass or discriminate against people who fall within certain protected categories. Title VII, the federal law, only has 3 categories: nationality, disability, and religion, I believe, and or race. And California, where I live, has a really long list of protected categories. But so in California, if you harass someone because of their gender, their perceived gender, their gender orientation, their disability, perceived disability, there's this big long list. All of that stuff is illegal because it's about a protected category. If the bully is an equal opportunity bullier and bullies a wide variety of protected categories, then that's legal. So harassment and bullying are relatively the same behaviors, except for that if they're aimed at a protected category, it's illegal. And if they're aimed at everyone, it's not illegal. And that's really the major defining factor between the two. But the behaviors are relatively the same. When I read about harassment cases, those are certainly comparable to bullying cases. Some other points about harassment and bullying in terms of repetition. In harassment, the law does not require that it's repeated, so you can get in trouble for doing one thing that's harassment related. In workplace bullying, the legal and academic definitions tend to really focus on the fact that it is repeated. And actually, that's one point, is when you compare harassment and bullying, it's not apples to apples because harassment is a law. So everything about harassment is coming from the law. That's how harassment is defined. Bullying, we're looking at academic definitions, and there are 4 states that have laws regarding workplace bullying, and they're all different. All 4 definitions of bullying are different in those states. So, you know, we're kind of having to look at a lot of different things when it comes to bullying. In terms of power imbalance, it's not required by law. You don't have to prove that there was a power imbalance if you're going for a harassment court case. In terms of bullying, it's definitely included in the academic definitions, and the legal definitions allude to it. So, for example, the legal definitions in those 4 states say things like when a person is left feeling helpless, or a reasonable person is left feeling like, I forget what it is, unless if they're left feeling like they've been sabotaged. And so it kind of alludes to this idea that there's power imbalance. In terms of intent, harassment not required. You don't have to improve intent if you want to sue for harassment, and you know, it's not required. It doesn't have to be intentional. Regarding workplace bullying, this is an interesting point. It's up for discussion. So in one of the definitions in Nevada, where there's a law against workplace bullying, they refer to intent. They say something about whether the behavior was intended to or actually did cause harm, and that's part of the definition of bullying. In Tennessee, they don't talk about intent at all, and in California and Utah, they do talk about intent. So it's sort of up for discussion. I personally believe that intent doesn't matter. If somebody feels like they're being damaged by somebody else's behavior, it should be stopped. There's another, it's called the Healthy Workplace Bill, another law that's been looked at in quite a few states, never passed, but they also include intent in their definition. So they use the word malice, which essentially means intent. In terms of subjectivity, the law doesn't focus on subjectivity. It doesn't matter if, or somebody doesn't have to prove that they were harmed by the harassment in order for it to be legal. But in bullying, all of the definitions do really focus on the fact that it's harmful. And finally, harassment can come from anyone, and so can bullying. It can come from a peer, a superior, supervisor, a subordinate, a vendor, all of the above. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in and talk about selling change to the CEO. So I'm going to give you 3 steps to sell the idea of change and sell the idea of bullying to the CEO. And before I do that, you might have a really great CEO. You might have somebody that you work for that you just love to death. He or she is a great leader in a lot of ways, and you love working with them, except for they can't seem to be convinced that there's workplace bullying. And that was my problem, as I said earlier. I actually really liked my executive director. He was a great guy. He had a lot of leadership qualities that I absolutely would love to emulate should I find myself leading a company ever in the future. But he wouldn't listen when I talked about workplace bullying, and I couldn't seem to sell him on the idea. And out of frustration, I have continued to look for ways to make that happen, and wanted to share that with you. So there are 3 steps to selling the idea of bullying and the idea of change to the CEO. The first is to identify the CEO's hot buttons. The second is to gather evidence, and the third is to then offer a solution around the hot buttons. So these are the 3 steps I'm going to take you through over the course of the rest of the webinar. So I'm going to ask you a question. What are your CEO's hot buttons? And what I mean by that is, what does your CEO talk about a lot? What context does your CEO operate in? So let me give you an example. I worked at a startup company for a while, and you know, if you've worked in a startup, they're a lot of fun. Everybody is really energetic, lots of hours put in. And the CEO was working with some mentors on, you know, making his company go. And I remember he came home from one of his meetings with his mentors, and he said, he says that I have to have sort of stupid vision on my website. What's the point of a vision? My vision is to make money. That's what I care about. We got to make money, and nothing else matters. And everything became about making money. And when you asked him any sort of question or had an idea, the answer was always, well, how's this going to make money? And in fact, a lot of times he'd kind of walk down the hall, and he'd pass you, or he'd see you in your cubicle, and he'd point at you and he'd say, hey, Catherine, what's our vision? And you'd say, making money. And he'd say, exactly. And so he was sort of scoffing at this idea that he was supposed to have some overarching corporate vision, because his vision was to make money. So that's what he focused on. So if I was going to talk to that CEO about workplace bullying, I would have to talk about it in the context of how it's affecting our ability to make money. I'll give you another example. If you've seen the Domino's commercials over the last few years, they've recently gotten a new CEO, and that CEO is really focused on branding. So when he first became the president of Domino's, the CEO of Domino's, he had a commercial out where he basically said, I recognize that Domino's pizza sucks. It doesn't taste very good. It's a horrible recipe, and I'm going to fix that. And that was his first step in branding. These days, Domino's has removed pizza from their name, so now they're just Domino's, and that's because they serve a lot of other food beyond pizza. And they've made a big deal out of it. They've got commercials where people are kind of blowing off the word pizza off of the building, so that to make a point, we're just Domino's, we sell more than pizza. So what I'm getting at is, if you worked at Domino's and you wanted to talk to the CEO about bullying, you would want to talk about bullying in the context of branding. So you would need to say things like, the bullying is hurting our brand. People who work at Domino's are going online at Glassdoor and talking about being bullied. You know, people who work at, you know, if we're focusing on the brand, people who feel bullied are going to engage in poor customer service. That hurts our brand. So what I'm saying is, you have to figure out what interests your CEO and talk about bullying in that context. So let me ask you, what are your CEO's hot buttons? What drives your CEO? What does your CEO talk about? What drives your CEO's decisions? And I've got a list of ideas there for you, but you may have some others. So I'd love to hear from you guys. What drives your CEO? What are your CEO's hot buttons? What do you think? I'd love to get some answers from you. All right, so I see one answer, you're a nonprofit, and so your CEO or executive director is focused on saving money, not necessarily earning money, okay? So everything's always about the bottom line, okay? So you would want to talk about bullying in the context of that it's hurting your bottom line, it's taking money from your nonprofit. Okay, so Patricia, I see accountability is something that your CEO talks about. So how could you talk about workplace bullying regarding your accountability and your image? You know, how does bullying affect accountability? Let's see, when revenue and productivity. So you're a poorly funded public agency, so you've got to always focus on revenue and productivity. So could you talk to your CEO regarding bullying and how it's affecting productivity and in turn affecting revenue? Okay, Sarah says your strategic plan. So Sarah, that plan and how does workplace bullying affect those buzzwords inside your strategic plan? So be thinking about that. How can you talk about bullying in the context of these things that you've shared here? So beyond the hot button, all CEOs do focus on the bottom line, even if they don't, like I said, the Domino's CEO focuses on branding, but in the end, of course, we focus on the bottom line. There are 3 ways to look at the bottom line. One is reducing costs. So some CEOs focus on reducing costs. So nonprofits, a lot of times, that's what they're focused on, for example. Another way is protecting revenue. And the third way to look at the bottom line is growing revenue. So your CEO might look at the bottom line through the lens of one of these 3 options. So Lynn, you said revenue. So it sounds like your CEO is focused on earning money as opposed to reducing costs. And again, all CEOs are focused on all 3 of these things, but usually based on the CEO's personalities and experiences, your industry, your company, there's probably one that they focus on more than others. So that's another thing to be thinking about. What does your CEO talk about so that you can talk about bullying in that context? So for me, going back to my startup, I couldn't talk to my CEO if there was bullying and I was going to talk to him about it. I would not be able to talk to the CEO about the fact that if we fixed the bullying, it would protect our revenue. That isn't what he cared about so much as earning money. So I would have to talk about bullying and the fact that, if Rich feels bullied, he's not making or not engaging in the best customer service. And that's going to hurt our ability to grow revenue. He's not going to be able to upsell if he's going into phone conversations with our customers feeling, stressed and anxious and fearful and all of these things. So think about which direction your CEO kind of focuses on when they're talking about the bottom line. So tip number 1 here is, again, connect the bullying to the CEO's hot buttons. Whatever their thing is that they focus on, connect the bullying to that. And focus on connecting bullying to the bottom line. So how do you do that? I'm going to give you some ideas. Workplace bullying definitely causes a lot of damage, as you know. And I like to kind of use this big list of things that happen when there's bullying. So when there's bullying in your organization, all of these things go up and all of these other things go down. So take a look at this list. Take a look at your screen. What on this list really resonates with you? What are you seeing as a result of the bullying? Which items here really stick with you? Okay, so I'm seeing patient care definitely would be an issue. So if you're in a healthcare agency and you're feeling and there's bullying, certainly that's going to affect your ability to work with patients. Absolutely. Okay, violence, not a good thing. Definitely something that needs to be focused on. So Patricia, you're seeing violence in your workplace and you still don't have your CEO's attention? Okay, I'm seeing turnover. Wow, Patricia. Okay, we need to talk. Let's definitely get together. That scares me for you, and so I definitely hope that we can get a chance to connect. I would love to talk with you more about that offline. Sarah says she's seeing turnover and loss of productivity. Lana, you're saying that you're seeing turnover as well. Lynn, discouragement. Okay. So how do you quantify those things, right? And that's going to be, in terms of talking about the bottom line with your CEO, that's what you're going to need to do, is quantify these things. So how do you do that? Well, I'll give you some tips. Just to give you a general number, there are two researchers, Charlotte Rayner and Lorelei Keishley. One's in the UK and one's in the United States. They are very big names in the world of academic studies on workplace bullying. And the two of them came out with a study where they estimated that because of all of those things that you saw on the previous slide, that they guesstimated that in an organization of 1,000 people, the bullying is costing about $1 million, not including litigation. So $1 million is lost in things like turnover, customer service, productivity, perhaps leaves of absence for stress and all of that kind of stuff. And so there's a number to share that in the organization of 1,000 people, we're looking at $1 million. Now, that's a nice big number, maybe a little scary, but your CEO may not care so much about it because it's not necessarily relatable to your organization specifically. So that moves us into our next step. You need to gather evidence and figure out how to quantify the damage that workplace bullying is causing. So one way to do that, and I definitely recommend that you do this, is to literally sit down at your computer, pull up an Excel sheet, and just start thinking it through. And I'll give you an example of something that you might end up with. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, let's see, here's my annual salary, and that works out to be X dollars an hour, and I've spent over 100 hours working on workplace bullying in the counseling that I've had to do, in the terminations I've had to do, in the exit interviews I did with people who left because they were bullied. So how much time have you personally spent on the workplace bullying, and how much does that cost your organization? And so, figure out a number, and it would just be a guesstimate, so figure it out. You might think about things you've seen. So perhaps you've noticed that after staff meetings, people often go back to their office and chitter-chatter about some sort of bullying incident that happened in the staff meeting. How much wasted time was that, and how much did that cost? One of the MOs of bullies is that they do assign a lot of overtime because they're giving impossible workloads. They have these crazy expectations. Is there overtime costs associated with the bully's crazy demands? So literally, just think about, what have you seen? What have you witnessed? And it will take you some time. You'll sit down and you'll kind of just put a bunch of stuff in an Excel sheet, and then you'll save it, and then you'll come back to it in a few days, and then you'll save that. You'll come back to it in a few days. And after a couple weeks of kind of working through this Excel sheet, you'll probably be able to come to some sort of number. And I recommend you do that. So just off the top of your head, when you think about the damage that you've seen in your organization, how much is bullying costing your organization? Can you just off the top of your head throw out a number? What do you think? I'll give you a couple little statistics. So one is that, there's a ton of estimates out there about what turnover costs an organization, and you see numbers anywhere between 60% and 125%. Those two numbers, that when somebody leaves an organization, it costs the organization between 60% and 125% of that person's salary in all of the lost work product and poor morale and time spent training someone new and all that kind of stuff. So that's a way to kind of look at the turnover. Another statistic for you that could help, the Canadian Safety Council found that people who feel bullied at work spend 52% of their day doing something other than working. So targets do indeed become very poor producers because they're spending over half their day doing things other than working. They are online looking up workplace bullying, they're looking for jobs, they're talking about bullying with other people. So something to think about as well. Anybody who's reported to you that they feel bullied, they probably spend more than half their day doing something other than working. So that would be another number you can throw in there. Okay, so In terms of the answers to this question, so Lana, you've had 2 employees that have left as a result of the bully. Okay, so that's, you know, you can kind of quantify that in some way. Let's see, Mikhail, you see that people are distracted, okay? Any other thoughts on how much bullying is costing your organization? All right, I want to give you another thing to think about. So a way to go beyond the just kind of sitting down and thinking it through is to do a prevalence audit. And a prevalence audit is basically working through or getting the opportunity to understand exactly what the problems are, and you can understand problems beyond the bullying and then develop solutions in order to measure success. So I want to share a case study with you about a prevalence audit, and then I'm going to show you how to do a prevalence audit. So, you know, this is about gathering evidence to show to your CEO. So I worked with a company in Northern California. They were a manufacturing plant, and they created aluminum powder, and they turned that powder into spheres. So apparently NASA uses these spheres made out of aluminum powder, and so do other aerospace industry, or the aerospace industry, as well as auto manufacturers. And this company was in the middle of nowhere, and all employees were people who graduated from high school. They got a job there, and they worked there forever. So they had a really big family culture. Kind of everyone in this town worked at this manufacturing plant. So the director of operations was the bully, and he came in as a college intern and had worked his way up to director of operations and had become a bully along the way. And so the CFO was in the same situation that you all are. The CFO went looking for help, and he found me and basically said, I have this problem. I'm the one who ends up doing all of the conflict resolution and the mediation, and I'm burnt out. I can't take it anymore. And the CEO doesn't listen to me. I've been telling him it's a problem, and I'm wasting a lot of time, and it's not making a difference. So we said, well, let's do a prevalence audit. And so what he did was go back to his CEO, and he said, look, I think there's a problem. You disagree with me. Can I have a couple grand to do an audit? And if there isn't a problem, we wasted a couple grand, not the end of the world. If there is a problem, we will save a lot of money, and we will, you know, we'll protect our employees, and we'll be an even better place to work. Can I spend a couple grand on the audit? And the CEO said, sure, fine. Let's see what happens. And so when I did my prevalence audit, I talked to the CEO first, and what I found were his 3 hot buttons. The CEO, his vision for the organization was to rule the world when it comes to powder. And he also talked about communication, and he talked about everybody need to be focused on the good as a whole. Those were his hot buttons, those 3 things. And I found some great things. I found that a lot of people at the organization were really on board with this ruling the world thing. They really believed that it was possible. The organization had very low turnover. People really did work there forever. And they loved the flexibility of the organization. They liked the culture in general. You know, so there was a lot of good things. But I did find a lot of problems. So one, unrelated to the bullying, was that the supervisors wanted supervisor training. They were hired in at 18. They worked their way up, and they never got any training about managing people. They wanted to have that. Great, that's a problem that we can fix. Related to the bullying, I found out that people, while they reported that they used to love the organization's culture, they didn't like it so much anymore, and that this one person, Forrest was the bully's name, Forrest had created a toxic workplace. And what I discovered in my survey was that over half of the workforce was considering leaving. So this was a huge blow to the CEO. He had never expected something like that. This organization had people who had worked there forever, and now all of a sudden he's learning that people were considering leaving because of this one person that worked there. Also, unrelated to the bullying, people wanted formal job descriptions and performance management. They didn't have something like that. Also not related to the bullying, the maintenance manager was really bad at project management, something that we could fix. So these are all things we could fix, right? And finally, back to being related to the bullying, we learned that the bully was using the sales process as a way to bully the sales team. And so he really uber micromanaged the sales team, and if they didn't fill out the sales forms exactly the way he thought they should be filled out, he wouldn't fill the order. So he was forcing the sales team to go back to customers and say, I'm sorry, I didn't check mark box 5 on page 2 of my sales form. What's the answer to this question? And then we'll fill your order. My fault. And so he was kind of using that as a way to bully. So here is what I suggest for you in doing your own prevalence audit. And this will help you gather that evidence that you need. So yes, you probably need permission from your CEO to do the audit, but do just like the CFO did. Go back to your CEO and say, look, if there isn't any problem solved, I'll stop bothering you about it. But if there is a problem, we can make a difference. So there are 2 ways to do a prevalence audit. One way is to do option A, which is to make your audit much more general. So if in some instances, the organization doesn't necessarily want to focus on the bullying. They want to get at the bullying through some peripheral questions. So in the case of the manufacturing plant that I worked with, that's what we did. It was one person who was bullying, and so a survey about bullying would not have gone over very well because it basically would have been a survey about how much you hate Forrest, right, the bully. And so we didn't want to do that. And the CFO's argument was basically that Forrest was hindering communication and all this kind of stuff. So we did option A in that audit. We talked about general things that the CFO saw were being harmed because of the bullying behavior. So that's one thing to consider when you're putting together your own prevalence audit. The other option is to literally ask about bullying. So with option A, we had one bully, wasn't appropriate to ask questions about the one bully. With option B, another example, I am working with an aerospace organization, and they have very prevalent bullying. It's all throughout the organization, and particularly it's the tenured managers who have been there for a long time, and it's kind of become this good old boys club, and they pick on the newer employees. And we are going to be doing some training on bullying, but there was a fear that the managers wouldn't believe that bullying was really a problem. And so we are doing a prevalence audit to prove to the managers that bullying and their behavior is bothersome for the new employees. So in that survey, we will be asking questions about bullying specifically, and here are some examples of what those questions might look like. So only you can decide, which way the audit should go, but that's my advice for you, is to decide, do I want to talk about more general things that will get at the bullying, or do we want to talk about bullying specifically? So then moving into the third step, so you've identified the CEO's hot button, you've figured out a way to gather evidence, whether it's just kind of your own estimation or if you want to do a prevalence audit, and then you're going to offer your CEO a solution. And so going back to my case study, I wanted to talk with you about what we recommended. But before we do that, I'm curious, what solutions have you offered your CEO so far when you've been talking to your CEO about bullying? What solutions have you offered up? Creating a policy, okay, Patricia, and what was the response regarding creating a policy? Was the CEO on board with that? So you're in the process of it. Perfect. Okay. So great solution. The problem is that with a policy, you have to then enforce it. So the policy only works if you're going to be allowed to enforce it. So hopefully you've been able to talk to the CEO about that. Let's see, strategizing on how to go at it, special challenges to his own behavior. Okay, so let's talk about that, Lynn. So Lynn says part of her problem is the CEO himself. So have you been able to talk to the CEO about his behavior at all? Have you been able to point out that people are unhappy because of his behavior. I don't know your relationship with the CEO, but how have you approached him so far about his behavior, if you have? I mean, one tip is, you definitely don't want to, oh, it's off limits. Okay. So, you definitely don't want to go to your CEO and say, well, people think you're a bully and you're a terrible person. But in my experience, and this is going to sound scary, and you're going to say, I don't know when I'm done saying this, but in my experience, people who bully respect people who stand up to them and let them know that their behavior is hurtful. And so it's going to be about the way you talk to him. So you're definitely not going to go in and say, well, you're a bully and people hate you, obviously, and I know you wouldn't do that, but that's one extreme. But at the other end, you want to talk to him about his communication skills and, talk to him about the fact that the way he communicates matters. And you could talk to him about the fact that as a leader, he's exemplifying whatever it is he wants from people. And, if he wants people to behave a certain way, that's the way he's going to act. And, you could talk to him about harassment. You could talk about bullying in that context, that you're concerned about your organization's culture and that, you see room for harassment claims coming through because of the way people behave. And so there's things you can say to him that sort of, go around the bullying but still get at it. So something else we can talk about offline. I know we've talked once before, but let's talk offline and see if we can strategize, and I can maybe help give you some ideas on things you can say. So let's do that, okay? So going back to my case study, just to give you some ideas on how our prevalence audit turned out, was that we ended up really focusing on the vision. So we said that formally we need to focus on the vision, and that was something that was already really powerful, something that was already happening, and it was like let's formalize that because everybody's already on board with it. The employees wanted to form system, their training, we put that in place. Project management for the maintenance department. So, that was one of the complaints. So we got the maintenance manager some training on project management so that people could feel like the projects they submitted were going to be fixed. Related to the bullying, as I said, one of the big issues was the process, the sales process, and that the bully was really using that process as a way to bully. So we decided that the bully needed to sit down with the sales team, the entire sales team, and that together they would develop a sales process that everyone could agree to, and they would do that with a conflict mediator in the room, and that's who would facilitate the conversation, so that the process would become something that they all agreed to as opposed to something that the bully could kind of rule and be in charge of. And then we also decided that because it was just one person that was a bully, that we could get him an executive coach and help fix him. And because we had a formal performance management system in place now, the bully would get the coaching through that system, and that he would be put on a performance improvement plan, and if he didn't change, eventually he would performance manage himself out, as we say. And so, the CEO, it was this realization that people were really that unhappy, and he had underestimated how unhappy they were. And in learning that so many people had considered leaving, that was really a tipping point for him, where it was like, gosh, Forrest, oh bully, you need to change, and I'm willing to let you go if you don't, because I can't have it like this anymore, and I didn't know it was this bad. And so it was a real eye-opener for the CEO. In the end, eradicating bullying gets organizational results. So when you have a civil workplace, you have improved communication and relationships. And when you have good communication and relationships, people are making good decisions. They're innovating. They're learning from each other. When people are feeling, the ability to be innovative and share their crazy ideas, and that they're learning from each other, and they get to make decisions, and they get to work together to make those decisions, then they're engaged, and they're happy to come to work. They're actually coming, And when they're there, they're engaged in customer service and their productivity is good, and therefore they're meeting organizational goals and getting bottom line results. So this is sort of my map to, you know, the connection between having a civil workplace and a bottom line result, that you have to have a civil workplace in order to reach all of these things. And so take a look at this stair case and think about it. The other thing is that in the end, people grow towards the light, and that's what I want you to think about. When people are happy and feeling civil and they're growing towards the light, they're producing and they're doing great things and they're thriving. People do not thrive in the dark, and neither do plants. You know, we thrive in the sun, and that's what your organization needs to look like. Your organization needs to be a place where people thrive. So again, the final, you know, the point of this whole webinar is that you have to connect the bullying to the CEO's hot buttons and the bottom line. And I've given you some ideas about how to understand their hot buttons and how to connect it to the bottom line. Again, whether it's that you sit down and do the Excel sheet or decide to go through and do the entire prevalence audit. So on that note, just to finish up, you know, this is where you are, right? You are here. And you came to this webinar looking for information. Maybe you came because you know of an issue and you can't resolve it. Maybe you feel bullied yourself and you're not being heard when you talk about it. Maybe you're at the end of your rope and you're beating your head against the wall. Maybe you're fed up trying to change behavior and not having support. Maybe you weren't sure if there was a problem or not, and you're beating your head against the wall. Whatever your reason is, you know, this is where you are. And you have to decide, how are you going to leave this webinar? What are your next steps? So I'm going to give you a little science lesson here. There is something called perturbation. Have you heard of this before, perturbation? Perturbation is the process that water goes through when it boils. And so water doesn't just heat up and then it starts bubbling and it's hot. When water boils, it literally changes structure. The molecules in the water literally become something different, and the atoms start spinning a lot faster. And so there's literally a chemical reaction that water has to heat for it to boil, and that chemical reaction is called perturbation. And so in order to get change, heat's required. And that's where you're at. You can't improve the culture. You can't eradicate bullying. You can't make a difference without heat. There's going to be a breakdown, just like there's a breakdown in the molecules in the water, but then you'll get desired results. So change is hard. And the reason I'm talking about this is understand that your CEO feels that and knows that, and even if they don't fully understand bullying, when you talk about bullying with your CEO, you're saying you have to make a change, and the CEO knows that change requires molecule breakdown and a whole process, and it requires heat, and it's scary for them. And so unless you can really get to them and talk with them at a level that makes sense to them, you're not going to get their agreement to make change. And so this is a hard process. And you know, to be honest, I can help you turn up the heat for your CEO with that audit. So you have to decide, do you want to speed up the process? I've given you a ton of ideas on how to go about proving to your CEO that there is a need for change. And so you can go the fast way or go at your own speed. So it depends on what you need. So what I wanted to offer you guys, since you took the time to come to my webinar, is an audit. And so if you're interested in going the prevalence audit route in order to prove to your CEO that there's a real problem, and you know, your CEO from me, you will get a report about your organization's strengths. It will talk about your opportunities for improvement, and it will offer up some solutions. And because you're on the webinar, I will give you a complimentary coaching session, and I will sit down with you. I will be there side by side with you, and we will talk to your CEO and whoever else, your C-suite, your board of directors, whoever needs to be there. I will talk with them, and I will be there side by side. So if this is something you're interested in and you're thinking that you want to talk to me a little bit more about the audit and what it entails, go ahead and type yes in the question box, and I will get in touch with you within the next 24 hours. So if you're curious about what this might entail, I would be happy to do this for you. So go ahead and type. So I see Lynn. She's super excited. So Lynn, I got you. I got you down. Patricia, got you. Jenny, got you. Anybody else? Give you going once, going twice. Okay, Angelise, I've got you. I will be in touch with you. All right. So before we close out here, I just wanted to ask, what had the most impact for you today on this webinar? I'm curious to know if there's something that you learned today that was really valuable for you. Okay, so thank you, Lynn. I appreciate that. Okay, so the hot button thing was good. Okay, good. The importance of an audit. Good to hear that. Okay. Awesome. You're going to talk to your CEO about perturbation. Okay, that's good. Teach them a thing or two about heat. Let them know you get it. Okay, awesome. Perfect. So, you know, in the end, I'm here to help, and feel free to reach out to me if you need. That's what I'm here for. You know, my mission in life is to help solve the problem of workplace bullying. And I'll share a quick story with you. I was working with a company to hopefully become a contractor for them and do some training at their organization. And their bullying was so prevalent that they had 2 suicides as a result of the bullying. And their CEO did not think that bullying was a priority. And so I'm telling you that because, you know, here they had 2 suicides, and that wasn't enough to let the CEO know that something needed to change. And we had probably 2.5 months of just conversations about how to fix this, how to get the CEO on board. And so we were supposed to have this final call in order to kind of solidify what we were going to be doing and moving forward. And 8 minutes before the call, I got an email from the VP of HR, and she said, the CEO has decided this is not a priority, and we'll be in touch with you next year. And I burst into tears because I was so bothered by the fact that there's a person out there walking this planet that didn't think suicide was a priority. And so I tell you that story because I want you to know you're not alone. This is an issue that a lot of people in your very shoes, you know, is facing in terms of working with your CEO. And so I'm here to help you. I understand it's a challenge. If you have any other questions, let me know. Feel free to shoot me an email. And by the way, I forgot to mention, in the handout there in your little webinar box, there's a handout link. If you click on that, you'll find a PDF, and it takes you through kind of the things that we went through on the webinar. And what I'll do is I'm going to put the webinar recording on my website, and it will be kind of a hidden link. And I will email you the recording so you can listen to it again if you want. And definitely use that handout and use it as a worksheet and